On most evenings, the railway buffet at Flaxborough Station managed by some sleight of hand to give the impression of life and bustle. This was largely due to Mrs. Vickers, who arranged chairs, teapots and baskets of slightly stale buns with a theatrical instinct for suggestion. Passengers arriving by the 7:05 from Lincoln could be persuaded to believe that a lively throng had only just departed, leaving behind half-empty cups and a comforting smell of weak tea. This Thursday evening, however, even Mrs. Vickers's artistry could not disguise the truth. The buffet was nearly deserted. A few weary souls sat hunched over tables like abandoned parcels, each determined to pretend they were elsewhere. The draught that seeped in from the platform carried with it an air of resignation and a faint tang of coal smoke. Inspector Pirbright sat alone at a table near the window, his hat resting neatly beside him and his coat folded across the chair back. Before him, a cup of tea of such dubious character that it might have been accused of impersonating the real thing gave off a timid wisp of steam. He drank it without complaint, his attention half on the newspaper spread before him and half on the subtle theatre unfolding around him. Flaxborough was a town that prided itself on its calm respectability, but Pirbright had long since learned to read the signs beneath that placid surface. Tonight, those signs took the form of silence carefully maintained between words, glances that darted and were quickly withdrawn, and the way a middle-aged couple at the next table stirred their tea in unison while refusing to look at one another. To the casual observer, these were ordinary people enduring an ordinary wait. To Pirbright, they were the ever-shifting cogs of the small machine called human nature. He had no particular expectation of drama. Flaxborough, while occasionally turbulent in its own restrained way, seldom produced disturbances on the scale of murder. A petty theft, a drunken quarrel, an ill-tempered council meeting, these were the usual peaks of excitement. Still, experience had taught him to remain open to surprise. The surprise arrived, quite literally, at the door. It swung open with a rush of cold night air, accompanied by the clatter of boots on the wooden floor. A railway porter stumbled in, his face flushed from haste and wind. Behind him hovered a knot of passengers, curiosity and unease warring on their features. The porter's eyes swept the room, alighting finally on Mrs. Vickers. "Mrs. Vickers," he panted, "you'd best come quick. There's been, well, a bit of a find." Mrs. Vickers, who was rarely at a loss for words, blinked at him. "Find? What sort of find, Alf?" Alf swallowed hard. His voice dropped, though it carried clearly to every corner of the buffet. "A body, missus. Laid out proper, down by the goods siding." The room seemed to freeze like water, shocked by a sudden frost. A few passengers gasped while others leaned forward eagerly. Even the middle-aged couple stopped stirring their tea. Pirbright folded his newspaper with deliberate care and rose to his feet. "Perhaps," he said in his mild, courteous way, "I might be of assistance." Recognition dawned in Alf's eyes, bringing both relief and a fresh wave of nervousness. "Inspector Pirbright." "Didn't see you there, sir." "Aye, best if you come." "Never seen the like of it myself." They went out together, the crowd following at a cautious distance. The platform was a patchwork of shadows beneath the yellow glare of the lamps. Beyond the end of the line of carriages, the goods siding lay quiet and oddly expectant. The body was easy to spot. It lay beside a stack of crates covered by a canvas sheet hastily pulled back at one corner. Someone had placed it there with surprising precision, the arms at the sides, the legs neatly straightened, the shoes aligned as though for inspection. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, only a profound stillness that suggested the last breath had been taken hours before. "No one knows him," Alf said hoarsely. "Not one of our lot." "No ticket, no luggage. Nothing but the clothes he's in." Mrs. Vickers crossed herself. "Dear Lord above." "Do you think he was done in?" Pirbright crouched beside the body, his gaze steady and unreadable. The man's face was unfamiliar, middle-aged, ordinary, with no mark of violence upon him. The coat was of decent quality but unremarkable, the kind worn by dozens of respectable men in the district. Yet the shoes caught Pirbright's attention. They were well polished but bore traces of a reddish clay unlike any soil nearby. "Done in?" Pirbright repeated thoughtfully. "Perhaps. But note how carefully he has been arranged. If there was violence, it occurred elsewhere." "Here, someone wished only to..." "Present him." He examined the canvas, his fingers brushing over a corner folded twice with an oddly deliberate precision. A trivial thing, perhaps, but Pirbright's eyes lingered on it for a moment longer before he rose. "Dr. Bell will need to examine the body," he said calmly, "and we shall make a note of everyone who was present here tonight. Quietly, if you please. There's no need to add excitement to an already curious evening." Alf nodded and hurried off to fetch assistance. The onlookers, sensing both importance and the inspector's unspoken command, began to drift back toward the relative warmth of the buffet. Mrs. Vickers, lingering a moment longer, lowered her voice. "If you ask me, Inspector, this is a bad sign." "A stranger here of all places and no one to claim him?" "There's trouble brewing." "You'll see," Pirbright offered a small, non-committal smile. "In Flaxborough, Mrs. Vickers, most things arrive without explanation. It is only later that we decide what they meant." As the stretcher-bearers carried the body away into the night, Pirbright remained standing by the siding, his hands in his coat pockets. The distant whistle of a train sounded lonely and uncertain, as though questioning the scene it approached. The inspector knew, though he would not have said so aloud, that this was merely the beginning. The true disturbance lay beneath the surface, waiting for someone patient enough to notice. And Pirbright, as always, was listening. By morning, Flaxborough was fully alive with the news of the body at the station. It had spread with the particular speed reserved for information that was both scandalous and vague. A stranger found dead by the good siding was a rare enough occurrence to make people whisper, and its very lack of details allowed every listener to embroider the story to their taste. Mrs. Glass, whose house backed conveniently onto the high street, was up at dawn, already fortified with tea and purpose. By the time respectable households were setting out their breakfast toast, she had made 3 separate journeys under the pretext of errands and managed to convey at least 4 conflicting accounts of the previous night's discovery. In one version, the man was a foreigner, Italian or possibly Spanish, seen purchasing a single ticket to nowhere in particular. In another, he was a government agent who had known too much about something unspecified, but definitely sinister. By the time she reached the Bakers, he had become a wealthy recluse whose family had sent him away to a quiet country town to hide a terrible scandal. Each telling was received with gasps and knowing nods, and each listener departed to repeat the tale with adjustments to suit their own circle. By 8 o'clock, the town was humming like a hive, full of busy bees more intent on the sweetness of gossip than its source. Inspector Pirbright, meanwhile, walked calmly through this cloud of speculation. His unhurried gait and benign expression suggested a man entirely detached from the storm, though in truth he was listening with quiet attention. It amused him, in a detached way, to observe how quickly people's minds supplied connections and motives where none yet existed. At the station, the morning trains ran as usual, though with an extra flourish of curiosity from the staff. Alf, the porter, was enjoying a brief and unwelcome celebrity. He retold his story with the weary dignity of a man whose truth was being constantly misheard. In his original account, he had merely found the body while inspecting the siding area. By mid-morning, people were repeating that he had dragged it there himself, or possibly discovered it after a pitched fight with a gang of smugglers. "Didn't even touch him," Alf insisted, glaring at Mrs. Vickers, who was hovering nearby. "Just so I'm lying there neat as you like." "Never seen the chap before in my life," Mrs. Vickers sniffed. "And yet, Alf, you do seem very quick to say so. People will draw their own conclusions." "They'll draw them whether I say a word or not," Alf muttered darkly. The buffet itself had become a theatre of intrigue. Customers lingered over cups of tea, straining their ears to catch scraps of conversation. Mrs. Vickers, who took great pride in her role as unofficial custodian of the town's social pulse, alternated between indignation at the disruption and delight at the increased trade. Pirbright arrived quietly, slipping through the station doors without fuss. He paused for a moment to observe the scene. Mrs. Vickers bustling between tables with exaggerated briskness, Alf sulking in a corner, two elderly ladies whispering so loudly they might as well have been shouting. "Good morning, Mrs. Vickers," he said mildly, removing his hat. "Inspector," she exclaimed, as though greeting a celebrity. "You'll have heard, of course. It's terrible, simply terrible. And to think of it happening here, in our little town." "Indeed," Pirbright said, his expression politely neutral. "I should like to see the spot again, if you don't mind." He inspected the siding once more, noting that the crates had been moved slightly since the night before. The canvas was gone, and the only sign of the body's presence was a faint impression in the gravel. A few workmen loitered nearby, eager to offer their theories, which ranged from smugglers to secret societies. Pirbright listened patiently, making no comment beyond the occasional encouraging nod. Back in town, the gossip had grown more elaborate. By mid-morning, Mrs. Glass had decided that the dead man must have been connected to someone important in Flaxborough. She hinted darkly that certain prominent citizens were behaving oddly and that one in particular had been seen burning papers in his garden at dawn. She declined to name this person directly, which only added to the drama. At the police station, Constable Chubb was besieged by townsfolk eager to share their insights. He recorded each statement with painstaking care, though inwardly he longed for the simplicity of a missing bicycle case. One elderly gentleman insisted that the body was a warning from foreign powers. Another swore he had seen strange lights near the railway the previous night, though under questioning, these turned out to be no more than the reflection of a passing train. Pirbright reviewed these reports with his usual serenity. Most were useless, but he treated each with equal courtesy. He understood that people needed to feel part of the story, even if their contributions amounted to little more than smoke. By noon, the prevailing theory was that the dead man had been a spy. This conclusion was based on nothing firmer than the fact that no one knew him, which, in Flaxborough logic, was suspicious enough. Mrs. Glass had even declared, over a second pot of tea, that the government would likely send special agents to investigate, though of course they'll be disguised as something ordinary, like drapers or insurance men. Through it all, Pirbright remained calm. He had no illusions about what he knew, which was very little, and what he suspected, which was rather more. The body itself told him almost nothing yet. What interested him far more was the manner in which it had been placed. Neat, deliberate, almost ceremonious. Someone had wanted it to be found, and to be found in a particular way. As he returned to his office that afternoon, Pirbright allowed himself a small smile. The town's imagination was running wild, but beneath its noise he could hear the quieter rhythms of truth. It would, as always, be a matter of patience. The truth, like a shy animal, would emerge only when the town had talked itself into exhaustion. Until then, the inspector would listen, watching as gossip wove its intricate web, and somewhere in that web, he knew, a single thread was connected directly to the hand that had so carefully placed the body by the siding. Inspector Pirbright believed that useful truths often surfaced in the quietest of settings. A formal interview with notebooks poised and questions fired like musket shots tended to put people on guard, but a conversation held over a steaming cup of tea, with the soft clatter of crockery and the illusion of informality, could ease a tongue into saying far more than intended. Accordingly, his first stop after the morning's walk through Flaxborough was Mrs. Vickers' buffet. It was busier than usual, packed with townsfolk who had no legitimate business near the station, but who found themselves mysteriously compelled to sit in the vicinity of last night's drama. The smell of tea, damp coats, and curiosity hung heavily in the air. Mrs. Vickers herself bustled about like a general at the front lines. She saw Pirbright enter, and with a quick flutter of her hands, ushered him to a small table near the window. "Inspector," she said, lowering her voice, though it still carried across the room. "It's good of you to come back, though I'm sure you've heard half a dozen different stories already." "More than half a dozen," Pirbright said mildly, removing his gloves, "but none of them yet likely to trouble the official record. I hoped you might provide a steadier account." Mrs. Vickers beamed at this tribute to her reliability, though her eyes gleamed with the thrill of importance. She brought 2 cups of tea, one respectable, one barely drinkable, and settled herself opposite him. "Well, Inspector," she began, "it was just as I told young Alf. I'd cleared the tables after the 7 o'clock train and was washing up in the back when he came rushing in. White as a sheet he was, and babbling about a body. I went straight out with him, of course. Couldn't let him go blundering about alone," Pirbright nodded encouragingly. "You saw the body precisely as it was found." "Need as you please," Mrs. Vickers said with a shudder. "Laid out proper, like someone had taken care over it." "That's what struck me most. I've seen accidents, Inspector. Oh, the railway has its share, but they're never tidy. This was different. Almost respectful, if you follow me." "I do," Pirbright said softly. "And you recognize the man?" "Never clapped eyes on him before." She leaned closer, dropping her voice further. "But he wasn't a tramp, that's for certain. His clothes were good quality, though a bit travel-worn. And his shoes polished, mind you, even with the mud on them." "Reddish mud," Pirbright said, as if to himself. Mrs. Vickers blinked. "Why, yes, now you mention it." "Odd, isn't it? I can't think where that colour comes from round here." Pirbright filed this away without comment and guided the conversation back to the people present last night. Mrs. Vickers provided a detailed account, listing names with the precision of a woman who missed nothing in her domain. Several passengers had been there before the discovery, including 2 business travellers, a pair of elderly ladies, and a man she identified as Mr. Daltrey, the railway clerk. Mr. Daltrey was acting peculiar, she added thoughtfully. Kept glancing at the door as if expecting someone, then left in a hurry after the excitement began. Didn't even finish his tea. "Curious," Pirbright murmured. At that moment, Alf himself appeared, shuffling reluctantly toward their table. His cap was clutched in both hands, his shoulders hunched in defensive misery. "Sit down, Alf," Pirbright said kindly. "Mrs. Vickers has been most helpful." "I'd like to hear your part of the story now." Alf perched on the edge of a chair like a man prepared to flee at any second. "Ain't much to tell, Inspector. I was making my last round of the siding, like always, checking the locks, making sure nothing's been tampered with. Then I sees it, him, lying there, quiet as a church mouse." He swallowed hard. "Didn't move, didn't make a sound." "Just there. You touched nothing?" Pirbright asked. "Wouldn't dare," Alf said, scandalized. "Ran straight to fetch Mrs. Vickers. Thought she'd know what to do." "And you'd never seen him before?" Alf shook his head vigorously. "No, sir." "He's not from round here, I'll swear to it." Pirbright studied the man's face. Alf's fear seemed genuine, unshaded by deceit, but fear could make even honest men stumble. "Very good, Alf, you've been most clear. That will help us greatly." After Alf departed, Pirbright lingered over his tea. His gaze wandered to the room around him, noting how conversations hushed whenever he looked up, only to resume the moment he glanced away. Flaxborough's citizens were eager to play detective, but none of them wished to be suspects. Later that afternoon, Dr. Bell received Pirbright at his surgery. The doctor, a portly man with a perpetually exasperated air, handed over his preliminary report with a grunt. "Natural causes," Bell said flatly. "Heart failure, most likely. Nothing violent about it. The man was dead before anyone laid a finger on him." "That's most helpful," Pirbright said politely, though inwardly his interest only sharpened. Bell raised an eyebrow. "Helpful? Doesn't it make your job rather more puzzling? No crime, no case?" "On the contrary," Pirbright replied with a faint smile. When there is no crime, yet a body has been arranged as though there were, we must ask ourselves what is being concealed. Back at the station, Pirbright reviewed the list of names Mrs. Vickers had given him. Daltrey, the railway clerk, stood out. His hasty departure might mean nothing, or it might mean he wished to avoid certain questions. The two business travellers had already left on the morning train, leaving only vague impressions behind. The elderly ladies had been eager to talk, but had produced nothing more useful than speculation about spies. Pirbright tapped his pencil against the paper thoughtfully. The body itself told him very little so far, but the living, their words, their silences, their small, unconscious gestures were beginning to form a pattern. By evening, he had arranged to speak privately with Mr. Daltrey and a few others. These would not be interrogations, merely polite conversations over tea conducted in drawing rooms and kitchens where people felt safest. It was there, Pirbright knew, that truth tended to slip out, disguised as casual remark or idle recollection. As the lamps were lit across Flaxborough and the town settled into its nightly rituals, Pirbright walked back through the square, his pace unhurried. Behind the windows, he glimpsed families gathered at tables, couples bent over cups, solitary figures reading by firelight. The inspector's thoughts returned to the body by the siding, laid out carefully, almost reverently, in a place where no one belonged. A man dead of natural causes was no mystery, but a man deliberately positioned to be discovered, that was a riddle worth solving. And somewhere among these ordinary tea-drinking citizens, someone knew exactly why it had been done. The morning after his initial round of polite conversations, Pirbright returned to the station office with the quiet air of a man expecting little and prepared to notice much. The railway staff, already nervously alert to his presence, redoubled their efforts to appear industrious. Papers were shuffled, inkwells were straightened, and even the ancient wall clock seemed to tick with exaggerated precision. Mr. Daltrey, the railway clerk, was at his high desk by the window, spectacles perched precariously on his nose. At the sight of Pirbright, he jumped as though caught mid-crime and began flipping through a ledger with unnecessary vigor. "Good morning," Pirbright said pleasantly. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Daltrey managed a strained smile.
"Not at all, Inspector. Not at all.
"Just catching up on some routine entries." "Busy night, what with all the excitement?" Pirbright glanced at the open ledger. His expression gave nothing away, but his gaze lingered on a particular page where a dark smudge partially obscured one of the entries. The neat columns of times and consignments were otherwise impeccable. "I wonder," Pirbright said mildly, "if you could help me trace the movement of goods through the siding yesterday evening, merely to ensure that nothing has gone astray in all the commotion." "Of course, sir," Daltrey replied, his voice too quick. "Everything accounted for, I'm sure."
"But I'll just check."
He began turning pages with exaggerated care. Pirbright watched without comment. Daltrey's hands were steady enough at first, but as he neared the smudged entry, a tremor appeared. The clerk hesitated, then forced his fingers to continue. "There," Daltrey said, pointing. "Last consignment offloaded at 6:45. Nothing unusual about it?"
"Local delivery marked as miscellaneous hardware." Pirbright leaned closer, peering at the faint, uneven ink. "Curious," he murmured.
"This figure here, 3 crates. And yet Alf mentioned only 2 on the platform when he did his final check."
"A simple mistake, no doubt, but mistakes are rather rare in your books, Mr. Daltrey." Daltrey flushed, his lips tightening. "Perhaps Alf miscounted, sir."
"It was dark." "Perhaps," Pirbright agreed softly. He straightened, giving no sign of suspicion, and closed the ledger with a courteous nod.
"Thank you for your assistance."
It is always a comfort to see matters so precisely recorded. As Pirbright departed, he caught a glimpse of Daltrey sagging against his desk, relief etched across his narrow face. The inspector's pace remained leisurely, but his mind was already sifting through implications. A missing crate might be nothing, or it might be everything. Outside, Alf was loading parcels onto a trolley. At the mention of 3 crates, his brow furrowed. 2 there were, he said firmly, side by side like always.
I stacked them myself.
If there was a 3rd, it must have walked off on its own. Thank you, Alf, Pirbright said. And you've no recollection of anyone lingering near the siding before you found the body? No, sir.
Quiet as the grave, begging your pardon, until I saw.
Well, you know, he shivered and spat to one side. Don't like thinking about it. Flaxborough's councillors, meanwhile, were proving less philosophical. By midday, word of the missing crate and Daltrey's uncertain behaviour had reached them. Councillor Fosdyke, never one to resist a tidy conclusion, declared in ringing tones that the matter was plain as day. Smuggling, Inspector, he announced in the council chamber, puffing himself up like a pigeon. The body is clearly connected to illicit goods. Our Mr. Daltrey has been tempted by easy money, and when this mysterious stranger discovered his scheme, you see the result. The assembled councillors nodded gravely, eager for a solution that absolved them of further thought. Pirbright, standing quietly to one side, inclined his head. An attractive theory, councillor. It explains everything.
Except the absence of evidence, Fosdyke bristled.
The missing crate is the evidence. Perhaps, Pirbright said mildly, or perhaps it is merely absent. The exchange left the councillors murmuring among themselves. By the time Pirbright returned to his office, the town was already repeating the tale as fact. Daltrey the clerk, secretly a smuggler, caught out by a traveller who paid for his discovery with his life. Mrs. Glass added a flourish by suggesting the traveller was a foreign agent, while Mrs. Vickers, not to be outdone, hinted darkly that certain council funds might be involved. Through it all, Daltrey himself became visibly more agitated. When Pirbright visited his lodgings that evening, he found the man hunched over a small, meticulously tidy desk, his hands twitching at his sides. "I've done nothing wrong," Daltrey blurted before the inspector had even sat down.
I've worked here 20 years, Inspector.
20 years without a blot on my record. No one has suggested otherwise, Pirbright said gently, though of course people will talk.
That is their nature. Daltrey's eyes darted wildly. It's absurd. I never even touched that man. I only wanted to keep the record straight.
If something's missing, it's someone else's doing. Pirbright let the words spill unchecked, noting their tone rather than their content.
At last, he said, "Tell me about this altered entry." Daltrey froze.
Altered?
I didn't. His mouth worked soundlessly for a moment.
Perhaps the ink smudged.
Old pens, you know? Yes, Pirbright said softly.
Old pens are troublesome things. When he left, Daltrey was trembling, though whether from guilt or fear, the inspector could not yet tell. That night, as the church bells tolled across the frosty rooftops, Pirbright reviewed his notes by the glow of a single lamp. Daltrey was a convenient suspect, anxious, solitary, and now publicly maligned. Too convenient, perhaps? Pirbright's pencil rested for a moment on a single phrase. 3 crates, now 2.
A small discrepancy, easily explained.
Yet it was the kind of detail that in Flaxborough could mark the difference between what seemed true and what was, somewhere, he was certain, the 3rd crate still existed, and with it, the key to why a man had been placed so carefully beside the siding, like a puzzle piece waiting to be noticed. The following morning brought a damp mist that seemed determined to seep into every corner of Flaxborough, softening edges and dulling colours until the whole town appeared suspended in a half-formed dream. The railway station, with its peeling paint and perpetually creaking doors, wore this shroud like a shamed old dowager who had given up on appearances. Inside the buffet, the usual clatter of cups and murmurs of conversation was subdued, though the air still carried the bright, metallic tang of curiosity. Mrs. Vickers was restocking the counter with a purposeful flourish that suggested not merely breakfast, but renewal. Every movement seemed calculated to convey that here, at least, Order would prevail, despite whatever unsettling events had taken place outside her domain. Inspector Pirbright, arriving unannounced, was greeted with a flurry of polite surprise and a pot of tea that steamed with nervous zeal. He accepted both with a mild nod and settled at a corner table. His gaze, however, was not on the teapot but on the buffet itself. The chairs slightly out of line, the smudges of shoe polish on the wooden floor, the arrangement of discarded newspapers. Mrs. Vickers bustled over, clutching her apron. "It's been quite the business, Inspector," she confided in a dramatic whisper. "Though you wouldn't think so to look at half the people who've been through here this morning, acting as if nothing's amiss." Pirbright offered a small, unreadable smile. "People often try to appear most ordinary at precisely the moment they are least so." Her eyes widened at this pronouncement, though she could not have said why. As she retreated, Pirbright rose slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, and wandered toward the section of carpet near the window where the dead man had last been seen alive, or so many now claimed. He crouched slightly, his head tilting in quiet consideration. There, nestled against the nap of the threadbare carpet, lay a small object that glinted faintly in the pale light. A button, round and finely worked, with a subtle crest engraved at its center. It was unlike the utilitarian fastenings on the railway staff uniforms, and its craftsmanship spoke of expense, perhaps even vanity. Pirbright lifted it carefully with his handkerchief, turning it between his fingers. A trivial thing, easy to overlook amid the more dramatic pieces of evidence, or the lack thereof. But Pirbright's attention lingered on the tiny crest, two curved shapes intersecting, reminiscent of a stylized bird in flight. He slipped the button into his pocket just as Alf the porter shuffled into the room, looking sheepish. Alf froze when he saw Pirbright examining the carpet. "Lost something, sir?" he asked, tone overly casual. "Found something," Pirbright replied mildly. "Tell me, Alf, do you recall whether anyone was standing near this spot the evening before last?" Alf scratched his head. "Hard to say, Inspector. Place was busy for a bit, what with the Lincoln train running late." "Could have been anyone." "Indeed," Pirbright said, giving no sign of disappointment. "Thank you." When Alf had gone, Pirbright returned to his table and set the button beside his teacup. It seemed almost absurdly small out of proportion to the weight of speculation swirling through the town. Yet there was something about it, an incongruity, like a single wrong note in an otherwise harmonious melody. By midday, he carried it with him to the police station, where Constable Chubb awaited him with the day's accumulation of reports. Chubb was eager to share the latest theory, his expression bright with scandal. "Word is, sir, that Daltrey's in deep," Chubb said. "Mrs. Glass swears she saw him meeting with a stranger behind the goods shed last week."
Says it was all very cloak and dagger. Pirbright set the button on the desk, letting it rest there between them like a challenge.
"And did Mrs. Glass describe this stranger?" Chubb deflated slightly. "Tall or possibly short. Thin or maybe stout. Had a hat, definitely." "Remarkably precise," Pirbright murmured. Chubb frowned at the button. "That come off Daltrey's coat, sir? Could be important, could it?" Pirbright asked mildly. "Daltrey's coat has brass buttons, yes, but plain ones without decoration. This, you will note, bears a crest."
"A rather distinctive one," Chubb bent closer.
"Never seen the like round here." "Nor have I," Pirbright said, slipping the button back into his pocket. "Which makes me wonder how it came to be embedded in the carpet of our humble buffet." That afternoon, Pirbright paid a call on Dr. Bell, ostensibly to review the medical findings once more. The doctor, who prided himself on brisk efficiency, was clearly impatient with what he regarded as unnecessary delays. "Heart failure, Inspector," he said with a sigh, handing over his report.
"I can't make it plainer than that."
The man wasn't struck, poisoned, or otherwise interfered with. His time simply came. Natural causes, Pirbright agreed. And yet, someone felt compelled to arrange his body with care and then walk away. Bell shrugged. People do odd things under stress. Quite. Pirbright's tone was serene, but his mind was elsewhere. He pictured the button again, lying alone on the carpet. If the dead man had been seated in the buffet before his collapse, his coat fastened neatly, how had one solitary button come loose? It suggested movement after the fact, hurried movement, perhaps even concealment. As evening fell, Pirbright returned once more to the station. The mist had thickened, blurring the gaslights into pale, wavering halos. He walked the platform slowly, pausing at the siding where the crates had been stacked. The third crate, still missing, nagged at him like an unanswered question. Alf emerged from the shadows, his expression wary.
Cold night, Inspector.
Best get yourself home in a moment, Pirbright said gently. Tell me, Alf, did you happen to notice whether Mr. Daltrey's coat was missing any buttons last we spoke? Alf blinked. Daltrey's coat? No, sir. Looked fine to me. He's fussy about his appearance, that one. Always neat as a pin? Pirbright murmured. How very interesting. He left Alf scratching his head in confusion and made his way back toward the buffet. Inside, Mrs. Vickers was closing up, wiping down the counter with methodical strokes. She looked up as Pirbright entered, startled but secretly pleased by the attention. Late visit, Inspector, she said. Quite, he agreed, his eyes scanning the room once more. The chairs had been stacked, the tables cleared, the floor freshly swept. And yet, to Pirbright's mind, the impression of that lone button remained, like a whisper that refused to fade. The button itself was a small thing.
Insignificant, one might say.
But, in Pirbright's experience, it was often the smallest objects that unlocked the largest mysteries. He left the buffet with a quiet sense of certainty forming at the edges of his thoughts. The body, the missing crate, the altered ledger, all were pieces of a puzzle. And now, in the shape of a single, finely engraved button, he believed he had found the piece that did not belong. Somewhere in Flaxborough, there was a coat missing one very particular button, and the person who owned that coat, whether they realized it or not, had just stepped into the inspector's patient waiting trap. By the following morning, the mist that had blanketed Flaxborough began to thin, revealing a town outwardly unchanged but inwardly restless. Shop shutters rose, market stalls were set out, and the bells of St. Botolph's tolled the hour with their usual patient solemnity. Yet beneath this calm there was a faint, almost imperceptible tension, like the stretched string of a violin waiting for a note to be struck. Inspector Pirbright, seated at his desk in the station office, leafed through a stack of reports with the air of a man reviewing the symptoms of a familiar illness. They were predictable: petty complaints, vague accusations, and a dozen contradictory sightings of suspicious figures. Beneath the surface chatter, however, he sensed a pattern beginning to form, one thread tugging faintly at another. The button weighed lightly in his pocket, its presence almost absurdly small compared to the swirl of speculation it represented. Pirbright had not yet spoken of it, not even to Constable Chubb. He preferred, at this stage, to let its meaning ripen in silence. By mid-morning, he set out to call on several townsfolk whose names had surfaced during the course of his inquiries. His first visit was to Councillor Fosdyke, who maintained a modest office above a drapery shop. Fosdyke greeted him with a politeness that was only slightly brittle. "A shocking business, Inspector," he said, gesturing toward a chair. "Quite dreadful for our town's reputation. You must be eager to have it resolved quickly." Pirbright seated himself with deliberate care. "Naturally, though resolution requires certainty, and certainty, I find, is best approached slowly." Fosdyke's hands fluttered briefly before settling on his blotter. Yes, of course. But surely this Clark fellow, Daltrey, well, it seems obvious, doesn't it? A man in his position with access to records, tempted by easy gain. It's practically a textbook case." "Indeed," Pirbright said mildly. "And yet sometimes the most obvious thread in a tapestry merely hides the more intricate pattern beneath." The councillor's smile faltered. "You think there's more to it?" "I think," Pirbright replied, that appearances in Flaxborough are often curated. He let the word hang in the air before rising, offering a courteous bow of the head. Fosdyke, caught off guard, merely nodded and watched him leave with a furrowed brow. From Fosdyke's office, Pirbright walked to the railway clerk's lodging house. Daltrey had not emerged since their last conversation, and his landlady, a formidable woman with a booming voice, confided that he had taken to pacing his room at odd hours. He's nervous. "Inspector," she said with a certain relish, jumpy as a cat on a clothesline. "I told him straight out that worry won't change a thing, but he just mutters about being wrongly accused. Not that he's said what of." Pirbright listened, his expression serene. The landlady's remarks confirmed what he had suspected. Daltrey's anxiety was genuine, but its cause remained murky. The inspector's next call was to Mrs. Glass, who met him at her garden gate with the unbridled enthusiasm of a gossip whose cup runneth over. "Inspector, I was just telling my niece only this morning that you would surely want to hear what I've learned."
"Such goings-on."
She leaned closer, lowering her voice to a stage whisper. "I've it on the best authority that a certain prominent figure was seen speaking in hushed tones with a stranger 2 nights ago. Near the station, no less. It was most suspicious." Pirbright inclined his head gravely.
"And this prominent figure was—"
Mrs. Glass hesitated, savouring the moment. "Well, one hates to name names, of course, but I will say he's very fond of polished shoes and even fonder of polished speeches." "Your discretion does you credit," Pirbright said smoothly. As she chattered on, he allowed her words to flow past, plucking out only the useful fragments. Gossip, like silt, required careful sieving to reveal the few grains of gold beneath the mud. By afternoon, Pirbright's path led him to the bell tower of St. Bartolph's, where Jack Malkin, the chief ringer, was oiling the ropes with grim concentration. Malkin was a man of few words and many resentments. His life measured out in the solemn clang of bells and the equally solemn tolling of minor grievances. When asked about the night of the discovery, he admitted grudgingly to having been in the tower well past dusk.
"Didn't see nothing unusual," he said, "but I heard a cart rumbling by the goods siding."
Odd hour for it. Sounded hurried. Pirbright thanked him and departed, filing this detail alongside the missing crate and the altered ledger. As evening descended, the inspector returned to the station. Constable Chubb was waiting, eager to report.
"So we've traced one of the shipments from that ledger."
Local merchant signed for it himself this morning, swore blind there were only 2 crates. Said anything else was none of his concern. "Quite," Pirbright said, his voice neutral. Chubb hesitated.
"Do you think Daltrey might have, taken the 3rd one himself?"
"Seems likely." "Likely," Pirbright repeated softly, "but not certain." He left Chubb puzzling over this cryptic reply and stepped back into the misty night. The gaslights cast long, wavering shadows across the cobbles, and somewhere a dog barked without conviction. As Pirbright walked, he considered the threads he had gathered that day: Fosdyke's eagerness to assign blame, Daltrey's mounting panic, Mrs. Glass's carefully half-spoken insinuations, Malkin's overheard cart. Each was a single strand, delicate and seemingly separate, but in his mind they were beginning to weave together, forming the outline of something larger. Not yet clear, not yet complete, but undeniably present. The body by the siding had been the visible knot, the point where the threads converged. Now Pirbright's task was to follow each strand back to its origin, no matter how deeply it wound itself into the fabric of Flaxborough's respectable facade. "Word is, sir, that Daltrey's in deep," Chubb said. "Mrs. Glass swears she saw him meeting with a stranger behind the goods shed last week. Says it was all very cloak and dagger." Pirbright set the button on the desk, letting it rest there between them like a challenge.
"And did Mrs. Glass describe this stranger?"
Chubb deflated slightly. Tall or possibly short. Thin or maybe stout. "Had a hat, definitely. Remarkably precise," Pirbright murmured. Chubb frowned at the button. That come off Daltrey's coat, sir? Could be important, could it? Pirbright asked mildly. Daltrey's coat has brass buttons, yes, but plain ones without decoration. This, you will note, bears a crest. Rather distinctive one, Chubb bent closer. I've never seen the like round here. Nor have I, Pirbright said, slipping the button back into his pocket. Which makes me wonder how it came to be embedded in the carpet of our humble buffet. That afternoon, Pirbright paid a call on Dr. Bell, ostensibly to review the medical findings once more. The doctor, who prided himself on brisk efficiency, was clearly impatient with what he regarded as unnecessary delays. Heart failure, Inspector, he said with a sigh, handing over his report.
I can't make it plainer than that.
The man wasn't struck, poisoned, or otherwise interfered with. His time simply came. Natural causes, Pirbright agreed. And yet someone felt compelled to arrange his body with care and then walk away. Bell shrugged. People do odd things under stress. Quite. Pirbright's tone was serene, but his mind was elsewhere. He pictured the button again, lying alone on the carpet. If the dead man had been seated in the buffet before his collapse, his coat fastened neatly, how had one solitary button come loose? It suggested movement after the fact, hurried movement, perhaps even concealment. As evening fell, Pirbright returned once more to the station. The mist had thickened, blurring the gaslights into pale, wavering halos. He walked the platform slowly, pausing at the siding where the crates had been stacked. The third crate, still missing, nagged at him like an unanswered question. Alf emerged from the shadows, his expression wary.
Cold night, Inspector.
Best get yourself home. In a moment, Pirbright said gently. Tell me, Alf, did you happen to notice whether Mr. Daltrey's coat was missing any buttons last we spoke? Alf blinked.
Daltrey's coat?
No, sir. Looked fine to me. He's fussy about his appearance, that one. Always neat as a pin? Pirbright murmured. How very interesting. He left Alf scratching his head in confusion and made his way back toward the buffet. Inside, Mrs. Vickers was closing up, wiping down the counter with methodical strokes. She looked up as Pirbright entered, startled but secretly pleased by the attention. Late visit, Inspector, she said. Quite, he agreed, his eyes scanning the room once more. The chairs had been stacked, the tables cleared, the floor freshly swept. And yet, to Pirbright's mind, the impression of that lone button remained, like a whisper that refused to fade. The button itself was a small thing.
Insignificant, one might say.
But, in Pirbright's experience, it was often the smallest objects that unlocked the largest mysteries. He left the buffet with a quiet sense of certainty forming at the edges of his thoughts. The body, the missing crate, the altered ledger, all were pieces of a puzzle. And now, in the shape of a single, finely engraved button, he believed he had found the piece that did not belong. Somewhere in Flaxborough, there was a coat missing one very particular button, and the person who owned that coat, whether they realized it or not, had just stepped into the inspector's patient waiting trap. By the following morning, the mist that had blanketed Flaxborough began to thin, revealing a town outwardly unchanged but inwardly restless. Shop shutters rose, market stalls were set out, and the bells of St. Botolph's tolled the hour with their usual patient solemnity. Yet beneath this calm there was a faint, almost imperceptible tension, like the stretched string of a violin waiting for a note to be struck. Inspector Pirbright, seated at his desk in the station office, leafed through a stack of reports with the air of a man reviewing the symptoms of a familiar illness. They were predictable, petty complaints, vague accusations, and a dozen contradictory sightings of suspicious figures. Beneath the surface chatter, however, he sensed a pattern beginning to form, one thread tugging faintly at another. The button weighed lightly in his pocket, its presence almost absurdly small compared to the swirl of speculation it represented. Pirbright had not yet spoken of it, not even to Constable Chubb. He preferred, at this stage, To let its meaning ripen in silence, by mid-morning, he set out to call on several townsfolk whose names had surfaced during the course of his inquiries. His first visit was to Councillor Fosdyke, who maintained a modest office above a drapery shop. Fosdyke greeted him with a politeness that was only slightly brittle. "A shocking business, Inspector," he said, gesturing toward a chair. "Quite dreadful for our town's reputation. You must be eager to have it resolved quickly." Pirbright seated himself with deliberate care. "Naturally. Though resolution requires certainty, and certainty, I find, is best approached slowly." Fosdyke's hands fluttered briefly before settling on his blotter.
Yes, of course.
"But surely this Clark fellow, Daltrey, well, it seems obvious, doesn't it?"
A man in his position, with access to records, tempted by easy gain.
"It's practically a textbook case." "Indeed," Pirbright said mildly. "And yet, sometimes the most obvious thread in a tapestry merely hides the more intricate pattern beneath." The councillor's smile faltered. "You think there's more to it?"
"I think," Pirbright replied, "that appearances in Flaxborough are often
curated." He let the word hang in the air before rising, offering a courteous bow of the head. Fosdyke, caught off guard, merely nodded and watched him leave with a furrowed brow. From Fosdyke's office, Pirbright walked to the railway clerk's lodging house. Daltrey had not emerged since their last conversation, and his landlady, a formidable woman with a booming voice, confided that he had taken to pacing his room at odd hours. "He's nervous."
"Inspector," she said with a certain relish.
"Jumpy as a cat on a clothesline. I told him straight out that worry won't change a thing, but he just mutters about being wrongly accused. Not that he's said what of." Pirbright listened, his expression serene. The landlady's remarks confirmed what he had suspected. Daltrey's anxiety was genuine, but its cause remained murky. The inspector's next call was to Mrs. Glass, who met him at her garden gate with the unbridled enthusiasm of a gossip whose cup runneth over. "Inspector, I was just telling my niece only this morning that you would surely want to hear what I've learned."
"Such goings-on."
She leaned closer, lowering her voice to a stage whisper. "I've it on the best authority that a certain prominent figure was seen speaking in hushed tones with a stranger 2 nights ago, near the station no less. It was most suspicious." Pirbright inclined his head gravely.
"And this prominent figure was—"
Mrs. Glass hesitated, savouring the moment. "Well, one hates to name names, of course, but I will say he's very fond of polished shoes and even fonder of polished speeches." "Your discretion does you credit," Pirbright said smoothly. As she chattered on, he allowed her words to flow past, plucking out only the useful fragments. Gossip, like silt, required careful sieving to reveal the few grains of gold beneath the mud. By afternoon, Pirbright's path led him to the bell tower of St. Botolph's, where Jack Malkin, the chief ringer, was oiling the ropes with grim concentration. Malkin was a man of few words and many resentments. His life measured out in the solemn clang of bells and the equally solemn tolling of minor grievances. When asked about the night of the discovery, he admitted grudgingly to having been in the tower well past dusk. "Didn't see nothing unusual," he said, "but I heard a cart rumbling by the goods siding."
"Odd hour for it."
Sounded hurried. Pirbright thanked him and departed, filing this detail alongside the missing crate and the altered ledger. As evening descended, the inspector returned to the station. Constable Chubb was waiting, eager to report.
"So we've traced one of the shipments from that ledger. Local merchant signed for it himself this morning, swore blind there were only 2 crates.
Said anything else was none of his concern. Quite, Pirbright said, his voice neutral. Chubb hesitated.
Do you think Daltrey might have
taken the 3rd one himself? Seems likely. Likely, Pirbright repeated softly, but not certain. He left Chubb puzzling over this cryptic reply and stepped back into the misty night. The gaslights cast long, wavering shadows across the cobbles, and somewhere a dog barked without conviction. As Pirbright walked, he considered the threads he had gathered that day. Fosdyke's eagerness to assign blame Daltrey's mounting panic, Mrs. Glass's carefully half-spoken insinuations, Malkin's overheard cart. Each was a single strand, delicate and seemingly separate, but in his mind they were beginning to weave together, forming the outline of something larger. Not yet clear, not yet complete, but undeniably present. The body by the siding had been the visible knot, the point where the threads converged. Now Pirbright's task was to follow each strand back to its origin, no matter how deeply it wound itself into the fabric of Flaxborough's respectable facade. Somewhere beneath that facade, he was certain, lay the answer. And when it was uncovered, it would not merely explain a death. It would reveal what people in Flaxborough were willing to do to maintain the illusion of their own innocence. The next day broke with a sullen, pewter light that gave the rooftops of Flaxborough the appearance of a painting left unfinished. A thin drizzle fell without conviction, misting the windows and turning the cobbles slick. It was, in short, a day perfectly suited to mischief done quietly. Inspector Pirbright had barely settled at his desk when Constable Chubb appeared, his expression bearing a mixture of excitement and dismay. He held his helmet under his arm as though it might otherwise leap free and cause trouble. "Sir," he began breathlessly, "you'll want to come to the station yard at once."
There's been, well, something's gone missing.
"Another thing, I should say." Pirbright looked up with mild curiosity. "Ah, a disappearance to complement our appearance? How symmetrical." They walked through the damp streets, Chubb recounting what little he knew. A parcel, part of the goods shipment connected to Daltrey's much-discussed ledger, had vanished overnight from the storage room. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no footprints on the rain-washed ground outside. "It was there last evening, sir," Chubb said with emphatic certainty. "Alf checked it himself before locking up. This morning, gone. And no one's admitting to touching it." At the station, Pirbright examined the storeroom carefully. It was a small, bare space lined with shelves, the air thick with the mingled scents of twine, sawdust, and stale tobacco. Two remaining crates sat neatly in a corner, their labels smudged but legible. The third space between them was conspicuously empty. "Curious," Pirbright murmured, crouching to inspect the floor. "Nothing disturbed but the parcel itself," Chubb nodded grimly. "Which means it was taken by someone who had a key." "Or someone who knew where to find one," Pirbright said softly. He rose and dusted his hands. "Has Mr. Daltrey been informed?" Chubb hesitated. "He has, sir."
Didn't take it well.
"Went pale as milk and said it proved someone was framing him." "And perhaps," Pirbright said, "it does." As word of the missing parcels spread, the town's imagination redoubled its efforts. By mid-morning, Mrs. Glass was assuring anyone who would listen that the vanished crate contained contraband silks, possibly weapons, and almost certainly state secrets. Her account shifted subtly with each telling, but always returned to a shadowy figure seen near the station at dawn, a figure whom no one else could quite describe. Mrs. Vickers, meanwhile, declared that the theft was part of a grand conspiracy, though her version of events centered mainly on the disreputable habits of certain unnamed councillors. Through it all, Daltrey moved like a man pursued by invisible hounds. When Pirbright called at his office, he found the clerk sweating over his ledgers, his hands shaking so badly that his usually immaculate handwriting wavered into jagged lines. "You believe me now, Inspector, don't you?" Daltrey burst out before Pirbright could speak.
"First the body, now this parcel. Someone's setting me up."
"They want me ruined." Pirbright regarded him with tranquil interest. "Who might they be, Mr. Daltrey?" Daltrey's mouth opened, then closed. His eyes darted toward the window as though expecting to see his accuser lurking outside.
I don't know.
"But there are people in this town who would like to see me gone." "Most towns have such people," Pirbright said mildly. "Do you recall anything unusual about the missing crate? Its markings, perhaps?" Daltrey hesitated. It was marked miscellaneous hardware like the others.
But it felt
different, heavier somehow.
I remember thinking at the time that it was odd. Odd, Pirbright repeated, his tone thoughtful. A word that bears examination. Leaving Daltrey to his agitated scribbling, Pirbright walked slowly back toward the railway.
The drizzle had strengthened to a steady rain, drumming softly on the station roof. Alf met him at the door, looking more harried than usual. "Inspector, it's a bad business," he said, lowering his voice.
I swear I checked that room proper last night.
"Bolted it myself. If someone took that parcel, they must have had a key." "Perhaps," Pirbright said. "Or perhaps they merely wished us to believe so." Alf frowned.
You mean?
"I mean that absence can be as deliberate as presence," Pirbright replied. That afternoon, Pirbright gathered Chubb, Alf, and Mrs. Vickers in the storeroom. He asked each in turn to describe exactly what they had seen the previous night. Their accounts overlapped neatly until Pirbright reached a single, telling inconsistency. Mrs. Vickers insisted she had glimpsed all 3 crates when she passed by on her way home. Alf swore there had been only 2. The difference was trivial, almost laughable, yet Pirbright felt the familiar stir of interest that came when a pattern shifted. One of them was mistaken, or lying. As he dismissed them, he let his gaze drift casually toward the buffet beyond. The carpet had been swept, the chairs neatly arranged, and yet Pirbright's mind conjured again the image of the button he had found there. Gleaming, solitary, out of place, a missing parcel.
A missing button, a missing truth.
The symmetry was growing clearer. By evening, the story had taken on a life of its own. Flaxborough buzzed with rumours of gangs, spies, and dangerous men slipping through the shadows. Even the councillors, previously so eager to point at Daltrey, now shifted uneasily, sensing that their tidy theory was unravelling. Pirbright, walking home beneath the rain-darkened lamplight, felt no triumph, only a deepening curiosity. Someone had taken great care to arrange both the body and the theft, as if staging a play whose opening scenes had now been performed. The next act, he knew, would reveal not merely what had been done, but why, and when it came, it would not be loud or dramatic. It would arrive quietly, like the disappearance of a single crate from a locked room, a silence more eloquent than any shout. Night crept slowly over Flaxborough, bringing with it a heavy stillness broken only by the occasional bark of a distant dog or the rattle of a loose shutter in the wind. The day's rain had ceased, leaving the cobbled streets damp and gleaming under the weak light of the gas lamps. It was a night that seemed to encourage secrets, and Inspector Pirbright, whose very occupation consisted of coaxing secrets into the open, found himself walking its narrow lanes with deliberate leisure. He preferred to think while moving. In the quiet rhythm of his steps, threads of information could untangle and weave themselves into new patterns. Tonight, there were many such threads, the body laid out like a piece of careful stagecraft. The missing crate, the vanished parcel, Daltrey's rising panic, Fosdyke's eagerness to assign blame, and above all, the button, small, ornate, inexplicable, glinting in his mind's eye as vividly as it had on the worn buffet carpet. Flaxborough at this hour presented itself as a picture of perfect respectability. Behind drawn curtains, families took their evening meals, their voices muffled into a soothing domestic murmur. In the public houses, laughter rose and fell with the clink of glasses, though even there the tone was subdued, as though the whole town were holding its breath. Pirbright paused at a corner, watching a lone figure hurry past with a parcel clutched tightly to his chest. The man glanced over his shoulder, saw the inspector, and quickened his pace.
Not suspicious exactly, but telling.
In a place like Flaxborough, fear often manifested not as flight from guilt, but as flight from association. People did not wish to be seen near trouble, much less part of it. He resumed his walk, turning his steps toward the churchyard. St. Botolph's stood solemn and dark against the night sky, its tower rising like a stern sentinel. As he approached, Pirbright recalled Jack Melkin's remark about hearing a cart past the siding at an unusual hour. Such a detail could be dismissed easily, but the inspector never dismissed anything entirely. He walked slowly among the headstones, their inscriptions blurred by age and damp. The place smelled of earth and cold stone, a scent oddly akin to that of the railway storeroom. Here lay the town's past, silent and respectable, much like its present. Death in Flaxborough was typically a quiet affair, predictable, tidy, unmarked by drama, which made the staging of the body at the siding all the more jarring. A man dying of natural causes was ordinary. A man deliberately positioned to be discovered, his limbs arranged with care, was a message. But what message and to whom? Pirbright's thoughts circled back to Daltrey. The clerk was a convenient villain, visibly fraying under pressure. Too convenient, perhaps. His fear might be genuine, but fear alone did not equate to guilt. In Pirbright's experience, the truly guilty often displayed calmness, their guilt buried beneath a performance of innocence as meticulous as Fosdyke's polished speeches and shoes. The counsellor himself was another puzzle. His eagerness to see Daltrey condemned suggested more than civic zeal. Was it merely self-preservation or something deeper? And what of Mrs. Glass, whose whispers fanned the flames of speculation? She was likely harmless, yet her tales contained fragments that seemed almost too pointed, as though someone were feeding her morsels of truth mixed with misdirection. The missing crate troubled him most.
Objects did not simply vanish.
They were hidden, mislaid, or destroyed, each act carrying its own implication. The space it had left behind in the storeroom was like a blank space on a page, a deliberate omission inviting interpretation. The second disappearance, the parcel taken from a locked room, echoed the first like a reply in a conversation only one party could hear. As he walked, Pirbright found his mind returning again and again to the button. It had no business being where it was found. If the dead man had been seated quietly at the buffet before his final collapse, his coat fastened neatly, how had the button come loose?
And why had no one claimed it?
Such a small thing, easily overlooked by anyone but the kind of person who, like Pirbright, placed weight on the unimportant. By now, his steps had carried him to the edge of town, where the houses thinned and the fields began. A faint mist rose from the wet grass, swirling around his boots. He stopped and turned back, letting his gaze sweep over the darkened outlines of roofs and chimneys. From this vantage, Flaxborough appeared perfectly ordered, a quiet market town, its troubles contained within walls and routines. But Pirbright knew better. Beneath its surface, rivalries, ambitions, and old grudges interlaced like the roots of a tangled tree. The body by the siding had disturbed that soil, revealing hints of what lay below. The missing parcel had widened the opening. He considered, too, the possibility that the dead man had been less important than his placement. Perhaps he had been merely a prop, his death natural and irrelevant, chosen only for the story it allowed others to tell. That thought chilled him more than the night air. As the church clock struck 9, Pirbright began the return journey. The streets were quieter now, the windows darkening one by one. Somewhere, a cat yowled, and a door slammed with unnecessary force. He passed the buffet, its lights extinguished, its windows reflecting the lamplight in pale, watery blurs. For a moment he imagined the scene within, the chairs stacked, the tables bare, the carpet lying innocently beneath it all. Somewhere in that carpet's weave, the button had once lodged like a secret. Back at the police station, Chubb was dozing over a pile of reports. He stirred as Pirbright entered, mumbling about a delivery scheduled for the next morning. "Get some rest, Constable," Pirbright said kindly. "Tomorrow will bring its own complications." Alone in his office, he took the button from his pocket and set it on the blotter. It gleamed faintly in the lamplight, its tiny crest catching the light like a watchful eye. The inspector leaned back, his hands folded loosely. Somewhere in Flaxborough, a coat was missing this button. Somewhere, too, was the person who knew precisely why a man had been arranged so carefully by the siding and why a crate and parcel had disappeared without trace. The answers were close now, he felt. Close enough to touch, like the smooth curve of the button beneath his fingertips, silent but eloquent. All that remained was to wait for the next move, and to be ready when it came. The following morning dawned pale and brittle, a frost clinging to the iron railings outside the station and turning the cobbles into treacherous glass. The cold seemed to have seeped into the very fabric of the town, sharpening tempers and slowing movements. Pirbright, however, appeared impervious to it as he moved through his routine with his usual unhurried grace. The inspector had risen earlier than usual, not out of urgency, but from a quiet conviction that the day would be decisive. He sensed that the strands of his puzzle were ready to tighten, but they would need a careful hand. Pull too hard, and they might snap or tangle beyond repair. Daltrey had spent the night at the police station for his own protection, though he seemed to regard it as punishment rather than sanctuary. When Pirbright went to see him, the clerk sat hunched on a bench, his eyes bloodshot, his fingers worrying at a frayed handkerchief. "I'm ruined," he muttered before Pirbright could speak.
Everyone thinks it was me. I can hear them whispering.
"Even if you prove I'm innocent, Inspector, they'll never forget. It'll follow me all my days." Pirbright regarded him with a calm, almost paternal sympathy. "People forget, Mr. Daltrey. They forget quickly when given something more interesting to talk about." Daltrey gave a bitter laugh.
And what will they talk about next?
The missing crate?
The dead man?
Or the fool clerk who couldn't keep his book straight? Pirbright's voice was gentle but firm. "They will talk about whatever we allow them to see, which is why it's time we give them a little performance." Later that morning, Pirbright requested that all those directly connected to the case gather at Mrs. Vickers' buffet under the pretense of clarifying statements. Alf was summoned from his rounds, Mrs. Vickers herself from her kitchen, and even Councillor Fosdyke, who arrived with an air of self-importance that barely concealed his irritation. Jack Malkin was there too, muttering darkly about being taken from his bell tower. They were seated at separate tables, sipping tea and eyeing one another with varying degrees of hostility. Pirbright moved among them with courteous attentiveness, a quiet conductor, tuning an orchestra before the performance began. At last, he positioned himself near the window, where the light fell clearly on the carpet, the very spot where he had found the button. He let the moment stretch, the silence growing thick. "I have been considering," he said conversationally, "how small details reveal large truths. For instance, a misplaced figure in a ledger or a parcel vanished from a locked room. These are the sorts of details people notice." Daltrey twitched violently, but Pirbright's gaze did not linger on him. Instead, he continued, his tone almost idle. "And then there are details no one notices. A tiny thing overlooked because it seems irrelevant. A button, for example. There was a faint clink as Mrs. Vickers set down her cup too sharply." Fosdyke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Malkin shifted in his chair with a grunt. Pirbright withdrew the button from his pocket and held it up so that it caught the light. "I found this here, on the carpet. It does not belong to any railway uniform."
Nor does it match the clothing of the deceased.
"Which leaves us to wonder, to whom does it belong?" He let his eyes drift slowly across the room, pausing on each face in turn. Most met his gaze with bewilderment or suspicion. Fosdyke alone looked briefly away before composing himself, his fingers tightening on the handle of his cup. "No one wishes to claim it?" Pirbright asked softly.
How odd.
Such fine workmanship, surely its owner would miss it. The silence stretched again, brittle as the frost outside. At last, Pirbright slipped the button back into his pocket and smiled, a small, almost kindly smile. "Very well. Perhaps the answer will come to us in time. For now, let us return to practical matters. Councillor Fosdyke, you mentioned previously that the missing crate must have been part of a smuggling operation. Tell us again how you arrived at that conclusion. The question seemed harmless, even complimentary, but Fosdyke flinched as though struck. His reply was too quick, too rehearsed. Why, it's obvious, Inspector. Everyone knows these things happen. Contraband moves through towns like ours all the time. Indeed, Pirbright said gently. Yet you speak with such certainty, almost as though you knew what was in the crate before it disappeared. A ripple of unease passed through the room. Alf frowned. Mrs. Vickers leaned forward, and even Malkin's habitual scowl deepened. Fosdyke's colour rose. That is a ridiculous suggestion, he snapped. One hears things naturally. Of course, Pirbright murmured. One hears many things. He let the conversation meander after that, offering no further challenges, merely observing. Fosdyke's hands trembled slightly as he lifted his cup. Daltrey, seeing suspicion shift away from him, sagged in his chair with exhausted relief. Mrs. Vickers, ever alert to drama, darted glances between the men like an eager spectator at a tennis match. When at last the gathering dispersed, Pirbright walked slowly back to the police station with Chubb at his side. The constable was bubbling with questions. Sir, did you see how Fosdyke reacted to that button? He practically jumped out of his skin. You think it's his, don't you? That would explain why he's been so keen to pin it all on Daltrey. Perhaps, Pirbright said mildly. Or perhaps he merely dislikes untidiness, Chubb groaned. But sir, surely we have him now. Pirbright's gaze was thoughtful. Not yet, Constable. We have stirred the pond and seen the ripples, but the fish remains beneath the surface. Tomorrow I shall drop a slightly larger stone. The Oxford secret that died with him in Flaxborough. Autumn arrived not with dramatic tempests, but with a slow and inevitable settling of dampness over everything. The pavements, the hedgerows, the temperaments of its inhabitants. The annual charity fete held each year to raise funds for the church roof and the less visible needs of the parish was one of the few events capable of stirring even mild excitement. By mid-morning, the village hall was already warm with the scent of sponge cake, damp wool, and the faintly medicinal tang of furniture polish. Mrs. Edna Biddle, who regarded herself as custodian of the village's social standards, moved through the hall like a warship patrolling disputed waters. Her hat, a monument of plum-colored felt and feathers, bobbed above the crowd, signaling her location to subordinates who scurried to obey her brisk instructions. She was everywhere at once, rearranging the jam jars so that the marmalades did not fraternize with the chutneys, scolding a volunteer for stacking teacups too near the raffle table, and ensuring that the tombola prizes were distributed according to some inscrutable hierarchy known only to her. This year's fete had been granted a particular distinction. The opening address was to be given by a visitor from Oxford. Such an honour had been spoken of for weeks, and Mrs. Biddle had personally reminded everyone that they must present themselves with dignity befitting the occasion. The guest himself arrived shortly before noon. Edwin Trace was a tall, spare man whose clothes were well cut, but unfashionable, the sort that suggested he belonged to an environment where tradition outweighed novelty. His face was long and pale, his eyes deep-set and oddly distant, as though he were perpetually observing some internal landscape invisible to others. Under one arm he carried a slim leather portfolio which, by the way his hand clung to it, seemed to contain something far more important than raffle tickets or fate programs. The villagers greeted him with a mixture of reverence and curiosity. When Mrs. Biddle introduced him, her voice swelled with pride, describing him as a distinguished academic of standing and repute. Trace acknowledged the applause with a brief inclination of the head and a few polite sentences of thanks. His speech was perfectly correct and perfectly forgettable. A string of courteous remarks that seemed designed to reveal nothing whatsoever about the speaker himself. After the formality, he moved among the stalls, nodding at knitted tea cozies and jars of honey, though his attention appeared elsewhere. Those who attempted to engage him in conversation later claimed to have found him pleasant enough, if rather absent-minded. One or two remarked that he seemed preoccupied, even anxious, though whether about Oxford matters or village trivialities, no one could say. The fete continued in its predictable rhythm. Tea poured, coins collected, and competitive undercurrents flowing just beneath the surface.
It might have ended as uneventfully as it began had not a small boy burst through the hall doors at precisely 3 o'clock, breathless and wide-eyed. "There's a man lying in the churchyard," he gasped. "By the gate," not moving. For a moment there was only puzzled stillness.
People in villages were often found lying down in odd places without causing alarm. But when the boy added, "I think he's hurt," a ripple of unease spread through the crowd. Inspector Pirbright arrived shortly thereafter, his unhurried stride somehow managing to convey both calm authority and readiness. He was followed by Sergeant Love, who was less composed and considerably more winded. Together they crossed the damp grass to the lich gate, where a small group of villagers had gathered in uneasy silence. Edwin Trace was slumped against the low stone wall, his hat a few feet away, his face composed in an oddly peaceful expression. One hand clutched the leather portfolio, the other held a small, folded scrap of paper. Pirbright knelt, his movements deliberate, and took the paper gently. He opened it and read the message, 4 precise words in neat handwriting: "The truth will vanish." He folded it again and slipped it into his pocket before rising. Love hovered at his shoulder, peering down at the body. "Heart attack, perhaps, sir,"
Love suggested.
"Scholar like him, not used to country air." "Perhaps," Pirbright said mildly, his eyes lingering on the tightly gripped portfolio. "Though heart attacks do not usually come with prepared notes." Mrs. Biddle appeared behind them, her face a mixture of concern and suppressed outrage.
"Inspector, this is most unfortunate."
"People will talk. They always do, Mrs. Biddle," Pirbright replied gently. "And what they say will be fascinating, if not necessarily accurate." As the constables moved the villagers back, Pirbright remained for a moment beside the body, gazing thoughtfully at the scene. A quiet death at a village fete might be nothing more than ill luck. But Pirbright's instincts, honed by years of experience, told him that Edwin Trace had not come here merely to open a fete. Something had drawn him to this quiet corner of the world, and now he had left it with only a cryptic message and a silence that seemed, in its way, louder than any words. The wind stirred the leaves along the churchyard path, scattering them like loose pages from an unfinished story. Pirbright turned away, his expression unreadable, and began the slow walk back toward the hall, knowing that this was not an ending at all, but the beginning of a very particular kind of investigation. By the following morning, the news of Edwin Trace's death had spread through the village with the speed and adaptability of ivy, winding itself around every conversation, twisting to suit each speaker's preference. Facts were scarce, but the lack was not felt. Speculation filled the gaps with the exuberance of wildflowers in an untended garden. At the bakery, Mrs. Troughton informed the first customers of the day that the dead man was quite definitely a foreigner, citing his peculiar accent as proof. By the time the third customer left with a paper bag of scones, the theory had expanded. He was now a secret emissary from an Oxford college, involved in negotiations too sensitive to be spoken of. Outside the post office, Mr. Lazenby, who claimed never to repeat idle gossip, announced with a solemn air that Trace had been seen arguing with the solicitor only days before, possibly over inheritance matters. By mid-morning, this had morphed into a tale of hidden wills and illegitimate heirs. The vicarage contributed its own interpretation when Reverend Dodd, over breakfast with his wife, wondered aloud if the man had come seeking sanctuary of some kind. Mrs. Dodd, who considered herself a realist, countered that he had probably been the victim of a simple mugging. Neither theory survived the journey to the market square, where the butcher's boy repeated fragments of both. adding for colour the entirely fictional detail that Tracy's portfolio had been stuffed with banknotes. As the stories spread, so too did the subtle realignments of village opinion. Some spoke darkly of outsiders meddling in local affairs, while others hinted that the true scandal lay closer to home. A few more pragmatic souls focused on the disruption to the fate's proceeds, predicting dire shortfalls in the church roof fund. Everywhere, voices rose, fingers pointed, and reputations were polished or tarnished by implication alone. Inspector Pirbright, meanwhile, moved quietly through this swelling tide of chatter, listening far more than he spoke. At the grocer's, he overheard two women debating whether Trace had been poisoned by a jealous husband. Outside the schoolhouse, a group of children speculated with ghoulish delight that the dead man had been a spy. Pirbright's mild nods and polite murmurs gave no hint of his own thoughts, yet his eyes missed nothing: the nervous laugh of a counsellor, the too hasty denial of a shopkeeper, the way certain names were carefully avoided in conversation. Sergeant Love was less restrained. Returning to the station after a morning of listening to increasingly outlandish tales, he threw his notebook on the desk with a snort. "It's like a competition, sir. Each person trying to outdo the last with a wilder version. If half of it were true, we'd be dealing with smugglers, assassins, and a lost royal treasure." Pirbright smiled faintly. "Gossip, Sergeant, has its uses. While the substance may be fanciful, the direction of its flow is often revealing. People rarely waste their lies on matters they find uninteresting." Love muttered something about preferring solid evidence to shifting stories, but he grudgingly admitted that certain patterns were beginning to emerge. Several names surfaced repeatedly: Lionel Querrin, the ambitious councilman promoting a controversial redevelopment plan; Mr. Frobisher, the solicitor whose records were said to be labyrinthine even in the best of times; and Miss Celia Hargreaves, the retired schoolmistress whose interest in parish history bordered on obsession. By late afternoon, the village was humming like a beehive. The churchyard, now cleared of all traces of the previous day's drama, had become a place of pilgrimage for those who wished to lower their voices and speak with special gravity. Even the weather seemed complicit, a low mist settling over the rooftops and blurring the outlines of cottages like secrets seen through half-closed eyes. As Pirbright walked back toward the station in the fading light, he reflected on the transformation that had occurred in less than 24 hours. A quiet death had become a communal narrative, each teller shaping it to fit their own hopes, fears, and grudges. Somewhere within this web of invention lay the truth, small and stubborn as a seed lodged in the earth. And like a seed, it would need patient tending before it could be coaxed into the light. He did not hurry. In a village such as this, time was his ally. Those who lied would grow tired, those who concealed would grow careless, and those who knew nothing at all would provide, unwittingly, the very clues required. By the time Pirbright reached the station, the mist had thickened to a soft, enclosing veil. It suited his mood perfectly. The day's noise and speculation were behind him now. Ahead lay the quiet work of listening for what had not been said. The next morning brought a pale, chill light and a mood of muted expectancy. The village, though outwardly returning to its routines, seemed to hold its breath as Inspector Pirbright began his first formal inquiries. He had no taste for dramatic interventions. His method, like his manner, was quiet, measured, and politely relentless. In a place like Flaxborough, questions delivered too sharply only encouraged defensiveness. Better, Pirbright believed, to let people talk at their own pace and listen for the moments when their words faltered. His first call was to Mrs. Biddle, whose role at the fete had been prominent enough to make her a natural starting point. She received him in her sitting room, which was furnished with such an abundance of crocheted antimacassars and ornamental china that it seemed less a living space than a museum of personal victories. Mrs. Biddle's posture was as straight as her opinions, and both were deployed with similar force. Mr. Trace was a very courteous gentleman, she declared, though her lips pursed slightly, hinting at reservations she was not prepared to name. He did not linger over the stalls, but then one can hardly expect a man of learning to be fascinated by jams and knitted items. His speech at the opening was brief, but no doubt that is the academic way. She paused, then added with significance, "Of course, he asked a few questions about our parish records. Quite harmless, I'm sure," Pirbright nodded. Questions of what nature, Mrs. Biddle? Population, land use, things of that sort. He seemed especially interested in the church holdings from many years ago.
Naturally, I referred him to Mr. Frobisher, who has charge of such documents. She folded her hands with finality, clearly signalling that no detail had escaped her notice.
Yet, Pirbright's gentle prodding brought forth one more remark, that Mr. Trace had seemed rather pale when they spoke, though whether from ill health or some inner preoccupation, she could not say. It was not much, but Pirbright tucked it away like a small coin saved for later use. Next, he called at the vicarage, where Reverend Dodd received him with distracted politeness. The vicar was a mild, scholarly man whose thoughts tended to wander even in conversation. He offered tea, promptly forgot about it, and then spoke earnestly of Mr. Trace's interest in parish history. He asked to see the baptismal registers from the early part of the last century, Dodd said, rummaging vaguely through a stack of papers on his desk. Said he was tracing certain family connections, though he didn't elaborate. I assumed it was academic research. The vicar frowned, as if troubled by a half-remembered impression. He seemed troubled, Inspector.
Not frightened exactly, but as though he carried a weight he could not share. Pirbright listened without interruption, noting how carefully the vicar avoided speculating beyond what he had observed.
It was a contrast to Mrs. Biddle's confident assumptions, and the difference itself was instructive. From the vicarage, Pirbright and Sergeant Love proceeded to the solicitor's office, where they found Mr. Frobisher seated behind a desk that was both cluttered and fiercely defended. Frobisher was a small, nervous man whose eyes darted like minnows when questioned. At first, he insisted that Trace's visit had been purely routine. "A few questions about boundaries, nothing more," he said, his hands fluttering over a sheaf of documents. The sort of thing any historian might ask. When pressed, however, his account grew less certain. Trace had wanted to view original deeds, not copies, and had seemed unsatisfied by what he was shown. He said something about discrepancies, Frobisher admitted reluctantly.
I told him old records often have
irregularities.
It's no cause for alarm. As they left, Love muttered, "The man's hiding something."
You could see it in his face. Perhaps, Pirbright replied mildly. Or perhaps he's merely accustomed to being blamed for confusion he did not create, a common professional hazard. Their final visit of the day was to Lionel Querrell, who greeted them in his study with an air of brisk affability. Querrin was a man who enjoyed being at the center of things and disliked being suspected of wrongdoing. He answered Pirbright's questions readily, even expansively, though his answers had the polished quality of rehearsed speeches. He admitted to knowing Trace slightly, claiming their conversations had been limited to generalities about the village and its future development. "I am, of course, committed to progress," Querrin said, gesturing toward a map of proposed housing estates. But Mr. Trace's concerns were historical, not practical. Our paths barely intersected. Pirbright listened, smiling politely, and asked nothing that might disrupt Querrin's flow. When they departed, Love was again certain of the man's guilt. Pirbright, however, merely observed that certainty was often the enemy of clarity. As evening fell, the inspector reviewed his notes. Each account had been courteous and seemingly straightforward, yet when placed side by side, they revealed subtle mismatches. Mrs. Biddle's precision, the vicar's hesitancy, Frobisher's evasions, Querrin's smoothness, all were pieces of a picture not yet assembled. Somewhere among them lay the thread that connected Edwin Trace's final hours to the message he had left behind, and Pirbright, with his quiet patience, intended to find it. By the following day, the village's need for certainty had begun to coalesce into a single, satisfying explanation. It was inevitable, Pirbright knew, that the shifting sands of rumor would eventually harden into something resembling stone, and once hardened, it would be treated with the same reverence as truth. The name set in that stone was Lionel Querrin. Querrin, as counsellor and champion of the redevelopment scheme, was already a figure of controversy. His plans for new housing and modern amenities were seen by some as visionary and by others as vandalism. Edwin Trace's inquiries into old parish records, with their emphasis on boundaries and historical claims, had inevitably intersected with those plans. To the villagers, the connection was irresistible. A scholar arrives, pokes about in matters best left alone, and ends up dead. Who else but Querrin could have motive enough to wish him silent? At the police station, Sergeant Love presented the theory with evident relish. "It all fits, sir," he declared, spreading his notes like a conjurer revealing a trick. Trace digs into those records, finds something awkward, and threatens to expose it. Querrin realizes his shiny redevelopment plan's about to crumble, so he takes matters into his own hands. Clean, simple, very much in character if you ask me. Pirbright, seated at his desk with hands neatly folded, regarded the sergeant with polite interest. "You have constructed a neat picture, Sergeant."
Almost too neat. "I wonder, did you notice how swiftly the villagers embraced this theory?" Love frowned.
"People like a clear villain, sir. Easier to sleep at night." "Indeed," Pirbright murmured. "And easier still if the villain is someone already distrusted for unrelated reasons." Despite his reservations, procedure required that Querrin be questioned. The counsellor received them in his study with his usual outward charm, though Pirbright detected a strain beneath the surface. Querrin's handshake was firm but slightly damp, his smile practiced but not effortless. "Inspector Sergeant," he said warmly. "This is all terribly distressing, of course."
"Poor fellow. I barely knew him." Pirbright's tone was mild.
"You had some dealings with Mr. Trace regarding property matters." Querrin spread his hands, as if to demonstrate his openness. He asked a few questions, yes. Perfectly innocent ones, I assure you. He seemed fascinated by the history of the village boundaries. "I provided what information I could, but I have my own work to attend to." Love, unable to restrain himself, leaned forward. "Several people have suggested that Mr. Trace might have objected to your redevelopment plans. Perhaps even spoken against them." Querrin laughed, too quickly, too loudly. "My dear Sergeant, people speak against progress all the time. If I killed everyone who objected to change, we'd have no village left. No, I am used to criticism. It comes with the territory." Pirbright allowed the laughter to fade before asking quietly, "Where were you at 3 o'clock on the day of the fete, Mr. Querrin?" The counsellor's pause was infinitesimal, but it was there. "I was at home, preparing notes for the council meeting." "My wife can confirm it." "Very good," Pirbright said, making a brief notation. When they left, Love exhaled sharply.
"Did you see how he hesitated?"
"Clear as day, sir." "He's lying, possibly," Pirbright conceded. "But lies are like mist, Sergeant. They may obscure or they may simply reflect confusion. One must be certain which before taking action." Back at the station, Love grew impatient as the hours passed without decisive movement. "If we don't act, sir, he'll have time to cover his tracks." Pirbright looked up from his notes with a faint smile. "If there are tracks to cover, he may already have done so. But let us not forget, the simplest explanations are often the most comfortable. Comfort, as we know, is rarely an accurate guide to truth." That evening, as dusk settled over the village, Lionel Querrin attended a public meeting at the parish hall. His speech was polished, his manner gracious, and yet Pirbright, standing quietly at the back, noted the way certain faces in the crowd hardened at his words. The villagers wanted a culprit, and Querrin fit the role too well. Whether or not he had anything to do with Edwin Trace's death, the collective will of the community was preparing to condemn him. Pirbright's expression remained neutral, But inwardly he felt the first stirrings of unease. A man may be guilty of ambition, pride, or vanity, but those are not necessarily the same as guilt of murder. And in Flaxborough, the difference was rarely as clear as the villagers wished it to be. The following morning broke pale and damp, with a weak sun struggling to push through the lingering mist that clung to the rooftops like a memory that refused to be dispelled. The village seemed quieter than usual, as if holding its breath, though this was less from solemnity than from anticipation. There was a sense now, almost palpable, that events were moving towards something more definitive. People had their villain in Lionel Querrin, and they were content to let imagination do the rest. Inspector Pirbright, however, was not content. He and Sergeant Love returned to the churchyard to examine once more the place where Edwin Trace had died. The grass was still flattened where the body had lain, and a faint scuff marked the stone edge of the lich gate. It was a scene long since picked over by curious villagers and dutiful constables, yet Pirbright's experience told him that meaning often resided in the things overlooked, not in the things eagerly seized upon. While Love busied himself poking at the damp earth with a stick, Pirbright moved slowly along the path, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. His gaze drifted, apparently idle, over every stone and scrap of debris. It was near the base of the wall that something caught his attention. A small square of paper, no larger than a postage stamp, lodged between two stones and partly hidden beneath a smear of moss. He stooped, easing it free with care. It was stiff, yellowed with age, and bore the faded impression of an ornate seal, an Oxford College crest, though one difficult to make out in the smudged light. On the reverse was a single, hastily written number. 17 rubbish, Love said dismissively, peering over his shoulder. Probably blown here by the wind. There's been plenty of litter about since the fete. Perhaps, Pirbright murmured, slipping it into his pocket with quiet finality. Or perhaps not. From there, they walked to the solicitor's office to review the documents Trace had been so eager to see. Mr. Frobisher, visibly more anxious than before, produced the ledgers with shaking hands. Their pages were dense with cramped handwriting, the sort of entries only a solicitor could fully appreciate. "This is all very tedious, Inspector," Frobisher said, fluttering like a nervous bird. "Boundary changes, sales of tiny parcels of land, adjustments following the war."
Nothing of significance to anyone outside our profession. Pirbright turned a page, his expression bland.
Mr. Trace seemed to find significance. "Well, yes," Frobisher admitted reluctantly. "But academics do tend to make mountains out of molehills." He asked repeatedly about the years after the Great War, which are rather incomplete due to...
Certain losses in record-keeping? Losses? Pirbright asked mildly. Fires, damp, misfiling.
"Nothing sinister, I assure you." Pirbright closed the ledger gently. "Of course." His eyes, however, lingered on a section where several pages bore faint smudges of ink, as though someone had recently handled them with unwashed hands. As they left, Love grumbled. "So Trace was poking around in dusty old files. Doesn't change the fact that Querrin had motive to shut him up."
"It's obvious." "Obviousness, Sergeant," Pirbright said, stepping carefully over a puddle, "is rather like a fine hat."
Much admired when new, but very often misplaced. Later that afternoon, Pirbright stopped briefly at the bookshop to return a borrowed pamphlet. There, he noticed a small stack of paper squares identical to the one he had found in the churchyard. They were used, the bookseller explained, to mark items for sale in a private collection. Parish relics, old maps, things of no interest to anyone outside a narrow circle of enthusiasts. Pirbright said nothing, but the connection settled quietly into his mind. That night, back at the station, he unfolded the scrap again and studied the faded seal.
It was nothing, a meaningless fragment, dismissed by all but himself.
Yet it spoke to him of a hand that had been here, doing something small, precise, and deliberate? He thought of Lionel Querrin, so publicly denounced, and of the villagers so eager to believe. The scrap of paper lay across his palm like a whisper. It did not name the guilty party, nor did it absolve anyone. It merely hinted that the path to the truth lay not through grand motives or public disputes, but through some tiny act overlooked by all. When he closed his notebook for the evening, Pirbright's expression was as placid as ever. Only the faintest gleam in his eyes betrayed that he had, at last, found the first true thread of the puzzle, and that he intended to follow it, wherever it might lead. The mist that had settled over the village the previous evening lingered well into the next morning, curling low around the chimneys and softening the outlines of cottages and hedgerows. It was the kind of weather that made even familiar places seem slightly unreal, as if they were sketches yet to be inked. Inspector Pirbright, walking along the narrow lane toward the outskirts of the village, found it suited his mood. The investigation, he reflected, was much the same, outlines and shadows, with the essential lines still to be drawn. Sergeant Love trudged beside him, boots damp from the unpaved verge, his notebook tucked under one arm. "We're spreading ourselves thin, sir," he said with a trace of complaint. "If you ask me, we've enough on Querrin to keep us busy for weeks." "That is precisely why we must look elsewhere," Pirbright replied mildly. "An investigation that is too comfortable runs the risk of becoming decorative rather than useful." Their first visit of the day was to Mr. Lazenby, the proprietor of the village bookshop. The shop was a narrow, dimly lit place smelling of dust and ink, with stacks of volumes arranged in precarious towers. Lazenby himself was a thin, sharp-featured man whose manner hovered somewhere between condescension and fatigue. He listened with exaggerated patience as Pirbright inquired about Edwin Tracy's visit. "Yes, he came here," Lazenby said at last, straightening a pile of pamphlets with unnecessary precision. "Wanted local histories, particularly anything to do with church lands and old maps. I told him most of it was in private collections now, scattered and incomplete. He seemed vexed, though whether with me or with the state of the archives I couldn't say." "Did he explain his purpose?" Pirbright asked. "He muttered something about uncovering what was long forgotten. A bit theatrical, if you ask me. I assumed he was preparing some tedious paper for his Oxford Fellows. Scholars do love to complicate simple things." As they departed, Love muttered, "The man didn't seem overly upset about Tracy's death. Grief. Sergeant often wears many disguises," Pirbright said, though his tone suggested he thought this particular disguise might be closer to indifference. Their next call took them to Harcourt Farm, a weathered cluster of buildings on the village's edge. Mr. Harcourt, broad-shouldered and taciturn, met them at the gate. His expression was wary, his handshake brief. When asked about Trace, Harcourt's tone hardened. "He came here asking about boundaries," he said, leaning on the gatepost as if it were a barricade. "Wanted to know what land belonged to my family before the council started meddling. Said he'd seen records that didn't match the current maps. I told him what I've told everyone. This land's been ours for generations. No piece of paper's gonna tell me otherwise." "And did he seem satisfied with your answer?" Pirbright asked. Harcourt's jaw tightened. "He left. That's all I can say." As they turned to go, Pirbright glanced back and noticed Mrs. Harcourt standing in the farmhouse doorway, her apron twisted in her hands. She met his gaze for the briefest moment before retreating inside. It was a small thing, but Pirbright filed it away with the other fragments. The final visit of the day was to Miss Celia Hargreaves, a retired schoolmistress whose reputation for propriety was exceeded only by her love of local history. She welcomed them into a sitting room filled with neatly labelled boxes of documents and a faint smell of lavender. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea, though whether from age or anxiety was difficult to tell. "Yes, Mr. Trace came here," she admitted when Pirbright asked. "We met twice, quite by chance. He asked about parish matters, very polite, very earnest. I lent him a few notes I'd compiled on the period after the Great War. He seemed particularly interested in those years, though I never understood why. She paused, lowering her gaze. He struck me as a man under strain. Not frightened precisely, but
burdened. As they left, Love flipped open his notebook with a sigh.
So now we've got a farmer guarding his land like a dragon, a bookseller who thinks he's too clever for questions, and a nervous spinster hoarding old papers. It's like adding pieces to a jigsaw when you don't know what picture you're making. Exactly so, Pirbright said, stepping carefully over a rut in the lane. The picture will reveal itself in time. For now, we must simply collect the pieces. They walked back toward the village as the mist began to lift, revealing rooftops and chimneys like a photograph slowly developing. Behind those ordinary facades, Pirbright knew, were old quarrels and private bargains, secrets kept so long they had almost become truths. Edwin Trace had disturbed that quiet equilibrium, and someone had acted to restore it. The question was who, and whether they understood that their act had only deepened the disturbance instead of silencing it. The following night was thick with mist once again, the kind that turned gaslight into pale, trembling halos and made the village seem a place half-remembered rather than lived in. It was well past midnight when a sharp, hurried knocking startled Mr. Frobisher from his uneasy sleep. He stumbled to the door of his small house, clutching a dressing gown about him, to find a constable standing there with rain dripping from his helmet brim. "There's been a break-in."
"Sir," the constable reported breathlessly.
"At your office." Frobisher's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled suddenly from water.
My office? At this hour, but there's nothing to steal."
"There's plenty to damage," the constable replied grimly, and urged him to come at once. By the time Inspector Pirbright and Sergeant Love arrived, a small crowd had gathered despite the late hour, drawn by that irresistible magnetism of calamity that seemed to work strongest in villages after dark. The solicitor's building, with its prim windows and freshly painted door, now bore the indignity of a splintered lock and a window pane hanging like a broken tooth. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and old paper. Frobisher hovered at the threshold, wringing his hands.
I can't understand it."
The cash tin still here, untouched. The stamps, the petty cash, even my watch chain all here. "They weren't after valuables, Inspector." "No," Pirbright said softly, taking in the scene. The outer office was a chaos of upended chairs and scattered papers, but the disorder was oddly focused. Whole shelves had been stripped bare, the contents dumped in heaps as if someone had been searching with urgency, even precision. They were after something very particular. Love knelt beside one pile, flipping open a ledger. "Looks like they went straight for the old deeds, sir."
"Mostly stuff from the 20s and 30s.
They didn't so much as glance at the recent files. Frobisher wrung his hands harder. "Those records are ancient history, obsolete. I keep them only out of duty, and truthfully, half of them are so faded they're practically illegible."
"Why would anyone—"
"That," Pirbright murmured, "is an interesting question." He walked slowly around the room, his eyes following the strange patterns left behind by the intruder's haste. It was not random destruction. Pages had been pulled, studied, then either flung aside or carried off. Whole sections of certain bound volumes had been cut out cleanly with a sharp blade. It was the work of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for, and who feared discovery. Outside, the mist muffled sound but not movement. The crowd shifted and muttered, lanterns bobbing like will-o'-the-wisps. Among them, Pirbright noticed Lionel Querrin standing slightly apart, his face carefully composed into an expression of concern. When he caught sight of Pirbright, he stepped forward with the measured haste of a man eager to be helpful without seeming desperate. "Inspector, what a dreadful business," he said smoothly. "I came as soon as I heard."
"Is there anything I or the council can do?"
Pirbright regarded him mildly. "You can reassure the public, Mr. Querrin. Panic, like gossip, has a way of multiplying when left unchecked." Querrin nodded gravely and turned to address the crowd with practiced ease. his voice carrying through the mist like a sermon. His words were impeccable, calls for calm, promises of cooperation, but Pirbright noted, not for the first time, how perfectly they revealed nothing of the speaker's private thoughts. Inside, Love closed a ledger with a snap. "Whoever did this, sir, they weren't wasting time. They knew exactly what they wanted and where to find it. If you ask me, it's tied to Trace. Same person, most likely." "Quite possibly," Pirbright said, kneeling beside a drawer that had been forced open. He traced a fingertip along the edge of a missing page, frowning slightly.
"But we must be careful, Sergeant."
"The connection may be one of cause rather than identity. The same storm can have more than one lightning strike." As dawn began to pale the mist outside, the evidence was gathered, what little of it there was. No fingerprints, no footprints, only the silent testimony of the files themselves, now scattered and incomplete. Frobisher was inconsolable, muttering of ruined reputations and endless legal confusion. Walking back toward the station, Love's mood was as dark as the morning sky.
"It's all falling into place, sir. Trace digs up something in these old records.
Someone panics, kills him, then breaks in to erase whatever he found." Pirbright glanced sideways at him, his tone as mild as ever. "Falling into place, Sergeant, can sometimes mean falling into error. We must consider not only what was taken, but what others will think was taken." Love frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning," Pirbright said, pausing beneath the dripping branches of a chestnut tree, "that in the right hands, the mere idea of missing records can be as powerful as the records themselves." From somewhere behind them, the church bell began to toll the hour. It was a slow, deliberate sound, rolling through the mist like a reminder that time, like truth, could not be hurried. Pirbright stood listening for a moment, then resumed walking, his mind already turning over the pattern that was beginning, ever so faintly, to take shape. The evening following the break-in was unnervingly still. A thin frost had crept over the village, whitening the roof tiles and hedgerows, and even the usual scatter of voices drifting from the market arms was subdued, as though the very air had grown reluctant to carry sound. Inside the police station, Inspector Pirbright sat alone at his desk, the low glow of a single lamp casting soft pools of light across the scattered papers before him. Outside the window, mist swirled in ghostly patterns, dissolving and reforming like half-forgotten memories. On the desk lay the carefully gathered fragments of the case. Trace's cryptic note, the pages torn from the solicitor's ledgers, the faint impressions left on paper where words had once been written. To a casual observer, they might have seemed meaningless, mere relics of two unpleasant but unconnected events. To Pirbright, however, they were the scattered syllables of a sentence waiting to be spoken. The difficulty was in discerning its grammar. He leaned back in his chair, hands folded loosely, allowing his thoughts to drift not toward answers, but toward connections. Edwin Trace, arriving from Oxford with a portfolio and a private purpose, had asked questions about the parish records that no one else thought to ask. He had been precise, methodical, and, most tellingly, unwilling to share his reasoning. That secrecy had marked him as a man working against time, perhaps even against unseen opposition. And now he was dead, leaving behind a single phrase: "The truth will vanish." It would have been tempting to treat those words as melodrama, the last poetic gasp of an academic prone to theatrics. But Pirbright had learned long ago that final statements, however cryptic, often contained a kernel of plain truth. The question was what Trace had feared would vanish: a document, a fact, or a reputation. The break-in at Frobisher's office suggested a deliberate attempt to erase something, not merely to hide it, but to destroy it utterly. Yet the intruder's very precision raised doubts. In his experience, truly desperate acts were rarely so tidy. Whoever had rifled those shelves had done so with careful intent, not panicked haste. And there perhaps lay the heart of it. Someone in this village understood that the mere perception of missing records could be as useful as the records themselves. A carefully engineered absence could plant suspicion as effectively as any evidence. Pirbright's thoughts shifted to the people orbiting this mystery. Lionel Querrin, whose public role made him a convenient villain, was far too visible to act without being seen. His ambition was naked, yes, but naked ambition was often less dangerous than its quieter, clothed counterpart. The Harcourts had motive born of ancestral pride and stubbornness, yet their anger had been open and unrefined, ill-suited to the subtlety of the break-in. Mr. Lazenby, the bookseller, concealed disdain beneath his formal courtesy, but his involvement so far seemed tangential.
And Miss Hargreaves?
Here, Pirbright's mind paused. The retired schoolmistress, with her tidy boxes of historical notes, her careful courtesy, and her tremor of anxiety when speaking of the past, she had given him the impression of someone guarding not just information, but herself. It was the kind of guardedness that came not from fear of punishment, but from fear of exposure. In small communities, the two were often indistinguishable. He rose and crossed to the window, gazing out into the quiet street. A lantern swayed faintly in the distance, its light blurred by mist. It reminded him of the scrap of paper found near the lich gate, marked with the faded Oxford seal and the number 17. Such a trivial thing, dismissed by all but him. Yet in its very triviality lay its significance. Why would it have been there unless someone had dropped it during a moment of intense concentration, perhaps while hurriedly retrieving or concealing a document of greater value? Behind him, the station clock ticked steadily. Pirbright's reflection wavered in the glass, a still figure amid the restless shadows. He thought of how truth in a village was never a single shining object to be unearthed, but a patchwork stitched together from whispers, omissions, and polite lies. Trace had come seeking a clean historical fact. What he had found instead was a living thing, tangled and stubborn, with roots sunk deep into personal loyalties and old grievances. Turning back to his desk, Pirbright felt the shape of his understanding sharpen. The problem was not merely that someone had killed to protect a secret. It was that the secret itself had been hidden for so long it had become part of the village's identity. To reveal it now would be to unsettle not just an individual, but an entire way of life. He extinguished the lamp and stood for a moment in darkness, listening to the quiet creak of the building. Somewhere out there, he knew, the person responsible was lying awake, rehearsing explanations, calculating risks. Soon, that person would make a mistake, not out of malice, but out of the simple human desire to keep a mask in place just a little longer. When that moment came, Pirbright would be ready. For now, he allowed himself a single, private reflection, that the most dangerous lies were never shouted, never written. They were the ones spoken silently between neighbors, sustained by nothing more than a nod and averted eyes. Those were the truths that did not merely vanish, they were never allowed to exist. The following morning dawned with a brittle clarity. The mist swept away by a sharp wind that revealed every line and imperfection in the village's face. It was a day that seemed to promise action, though of what sort, few could have said. Pirbright, arriving early at the station, had already decided upon a course. His night's reflections had resolved into a plan, not of confrontation, but of observation. In Flaxborough, as he well knew, truth was seldom dragged into the open by force. It had to be coaxed out, politely, and with apparent innocence, like a shy animal emerging from its burrow. Sergeant Love, when Pirbright outlined his intentions, regarded him with open doubt. "You're telling me, sir, we're going to pretend we've found something just to see how they jump?" "Precisely," Pirbright said mildly, buttoning his coat. "People reveal themselves, Sergeant, not when they are accused."
But when they fear they might be. Love muttered about theatre and trickery, but followed nonetheless as Pirbright set about putting the first piece in motion.
By mid-morning, it was common knowledge, thanks to a few carefully chosen confidences whispered into receptive ears, that certain documents missing from Frobisher's office had been recovered. The rumour was vague by design. It did not specify what had been found, only that the evidence was now in safe hands and would soon be examined by the authorities. As Love had predicted, the effect was electric. By noon, the Market Arms was buzzing like a disturbed hive. Some claimed the missing records implicated Lionel Querrin directly. Others swore they proved the Harcourts had seized land unlawfully after the war. Still others whispered that the documents concerned ancient church scandals better left unspoken. Each theory contradicted the last, but the essential point, that something dangerous and incriminating had surfaced, remained constant. Pirbright moved quietly among the talkers, offering nothing but an occasional nod. His attention was not on the content of their words, but on the faces behind them. Querrin, when encountered in the square, was all smooth courtesy, expressing relief that the investigation was progressing. His manner was so perfectly modulated that it bordered on artificial. Harcourt, by contrast, displayed blunt hostility, railing against paper shufflers who would never understand the realities of land and labour. The bookseller, Lazenby, offered little beyond arched eyebrows and thinly veiled contempt. It was Miss Hargreaves, however, who interested Pirbright most. When he paid her a polite call late in the afternoon, he found her unusually pale, her hands trembling slightly as she poured tea. She listened as he spoke of the recovered documents, nodding mechanically. But when he casually mentioned that a full examination would take place at the council hall that very evening, her teacup rattled against its saucer with a sharp, betraying sound. "You seem uneasy, Miss Hargreaves," Pirbright said gently. "Oh, not at all, Inspector," she replied too quickly.
"It's just that—"
"These matters can unsettle one naturally." "Indeed," Pirbright murmured. He rose to leave with his customary politeness, but inwardly he felt the first true confirmation of his suspicions. Fear, unlike guilt, could not be rehearsed. That evening, the parish hall was filled to capacity. Ostensibly, the gathering was to discuss the break-in and reassure the public, but Pirbright's true purpose was quieter. He allowed Lionel Querrin to open the meeting with his usual polished speech, then stepped forward himself. His words were calm, almost casual. "Certain documents," he announced, "have been recovered and are presently under examination. In due course, their significance will be made clear. For now, I would simply ask for patience, and for any who might have knowledge of these matters to speak with me privately." There was a collective intake of breath, a subtle shifting of bodies. Pirbright, standing still at the front, let his gaze travel slowly across the crowd. Most faces showed only curiosity or confusion. A few displayed relief. And one, Miss Hargreaves, was marked by stark, momentary panic before composure was hastily reassembled. It was enough. Pirbright noted it and then stepped aside, leaving the hall to its murmurs and speculation. As the meeting dispersed, Love joined him near the doorway. "Well, sir?" the sergeant asked eagerly. "Did we catch our fish?" Pirbright allowed himself a small, private smile. "We have seen the ripple, Sergeant. The fish will follow in due course." As they walked back through the darkening streets, Love glanced sideways at him.
"And when it does?"
"Then," Pirbright said, his voice almost gentle, "we shall lift it carefully from the water, quietly so as not to disturb the pond." Love frowned at this metaphor, but said nothing more. He had learned, through long service, that the inspector's most delicate traps were rarely visible until they had already sprung. The following afternoon was bright but cold, sunlight glinting sharply off the frost-rimed windows of the parish hall. It was a day of deceptive clarity, the kind where everything appeared crisp and orderly, though beneath the surface the currents of unease still ran deep. The villagers gathered once more, their voices lowered. their movements constrained by that peculiar blend of anticipation and dread that comes before a reckoning. Pirbright arrived punctually, his manner as unhurried as ever, his expression giving no hint of what he carried in his mind. He paused just inside the doorway, surveying the room. Lionel Querrin stood near the front, immaculate as always, his face composed into an expression of concern that was just slightly too perfect. Harcourt loomed by the window, arms folded like a gatekeeper, while Mr. Frobisher hovered nervously near a pile of freshly tied bundles of paper, as if sheer proximity might defend them from harm. Miss Hargreaves sat in her usual rigid posture, hands folded tightly in her lap, her pale face turned slightly toward the floor. When the murmurs had subsided, Pirbright stepped forward. His voice, when he spoke, was gentle, carrying easily without effort.
Thank you all for coming.
I thought it best to bring clarity to matters that have, of late, generated more speculation than understanding. A ripple of shifting bodies passed through the room. Mr. Trace, Pirbright continued, arrived in this village with a very specific purpose. He was not merely an academic passing through, nor were his interests confined to quaint historical curiosities. He was investigating a particular sequence of land transfers made in the years following the Great War. These records, though seemingly arcane, had significant implications for certain present-day holdings. Frobisher's throat worked as though he wished to speak, but he remained silent, his eyes darting nervously toward the bundles of papers beside him. Over time, Pirbright went on, these irregularities were forgotten or perhaps allowed to be forgotten, but they remained embedded in the ledgers, faint traces of past decisions. Mr. Trace, with his training and persistence, saw what others had not, and he understood, too late, that what he had uncovered was not merely an academic puzzle. He let that sink in, watching the faces before him. Querrin's remained composed, though his knuckles whitened slightly on the back of the chair he gripped. Harcourt shifted, restless, as if ready to challenge anything that did not suit him. Miss Hargreaves did not move at all. Someone, Pirbright said softly, realized that Mr. Trace's discovery threatened more than a mere piece of land. It threatened a reputation, a legacy built carefully over decades. In small communities, such things are more fragile than they appear.
And so when Mr. Trace confronted that person, he was silenced. A sharp intake of breath came from somewhere near the back. Pirbright's gaze settled gently on Miss Hargreaves.
You had, many years ago, inherited land that was never rightfully yours. The mistake was not yours originally. It was the act of others, taken in confusion after the war. But when you became aware of it, you chose silence. Understandably so. You wished to protect your family name, your place in this village. That desire is not difficult to understand. For a moment, no sound but the faint ticking of the hall's old clock filled the space. Then Miss Hargreaves's lips parted, though no words emerged. Her hands clenched tighter on her lap. When Mr. Trace began asking questions, Pirbright continued, his tone still even, you tried to answer him politely, but he persisted. He meant no harm, but to you, his persistence must have seemed like an attack. The night of the fate, when he confronted you with proof, you acted in a moment of desperate fear. His death was not planned, not calculated, merely the tragic outcome of panic. The villagers stirred, a low murmur of shock passing through them. Lionel Querrin's face remained impassive, but his eyes flickered toward Miss Hargreaves for the briefest instant. And the break-in at Mr. Frobisher's office, Pirbright said, was your attempt to erase the proof Trace had found. But even as you removed certain pages, you could not erase what had already been seen or suspected. In the end, it was not the missing documents that revealed the truth, but the pattern of actions taken to conceal them. Miss Hargreaves finally raised her head. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, and when she spoke, Her voice was scarcely above a whisper.
I only wanted to keep what little was left.
If people knew how it began, they would despise us.
My father worked so hard to make us respectable. I couldn't let it all vanish. Pirbright inclined his head slightly.
Respectability, Miss Hargreaves, is a delicate thing. It can be preserved only by honesty, not by silence. Mr. Trace understood that. His note was not a threat, but a warning, a final kindness. The truth will vanish, he wrote, and he feared, perhaps rightly, that it would vanish unless someone chose to see it clearly. She bowed her head, silent now, while the others shifted uneasily. Even Harcourt, so blustering and certain, seemed momentarily chastened. Querin exhaled softly through his nose, his public mask firmly in place. Pirbright let the silence lengthen before he spoke again. There will be formalities, of course, but for now, let us acknowledge that this was not a crime of greed or cruelty. It was the simple human tragedy of a secret kept too long. No one spoke. Slowly, the villagers began to rise, their faces pale and thoughtful, and filed toward the door. They moved with the subdued care of people leaving a funeral, unsure what words might be safe to speak in the light of what they had heard. When the hall was nearly empty, Love approached Pirbright. "You were right about her all along, sir. I don't mind admitting I didn't see it." "Few do, Sergeant," Pirbright said gently. "That is why such secrets last so long." He turned toward the window, where the pale winter light spilled across the frosted square. "Truth," he added quietly, "is rarely loud. It waits, patient and still, until someone listens closely enough to hear it." The frost that had lingered so stubbornly through the days of the investigation melted at last beneath a pale, steady sun. With it seemed to fade, at least outwardly, the tension that had held the village taut. Routine reasserted itself with quiet determination. The market square once again smelled of bread and paraffin rather than speculation and fear. Shopkeepers swept their doorsteps. Gossip shifted back to the safe realm of weather and ailments, and the more fragile members of the community breathed a little easier, knowing that the mystery had been neatly boxed and put away. At least in public, Miss Hargreaves's house, at the far end of the lane, remained shuttered. She had withdrawn entirely from the village's life, her only visitors a few discreet officials and one or two neighbors who left parcels of food on her doorstep without knocking. Even the most inquisitive tongues were curbed by a kind of uneasy pity. Though her name would continue to be whispered, it was done with a softness that suggested both sympathy and self-preservation. In time, as with all scandals, it would become a story told less for its truth than for the teller's satisfaction. Lionel Querin, though exonerated publicly, emerged diminished. He attended the next council meeting with his usual polish, but his speeches were shorter, his manner subdued. Some noticed how his eyes flickered whenever old records were mentioned, or how his once confident gestures now carried a trace of hesitation. His redevelopment scheme continued, though at a slower pace, and while no one openly opposed him, the undercurrent of suspicion remained. In Flaxborough, a man's reputation rarely returned to its former state once cracked. The Harcourts, too, retreated somewhat from view. Mr. Harcourt still tended his fields with the same relentless energy, but his wife, who had once been seen daily in the village, seldom left their property. When she did, it was with a hurried step and downcast eyes. Their name had not been sullied, precisely, but something had shifted in the way others spoke to them. A slight, unspoken reserve, as if everyone now understood more than was being said. At the solicitor's office, Mr. Frobisher threw himself into a frenzy of organization. Shelves were labeled with military precision, drawers locked and relocked, and no document was left unattended for even a moment. To his clients, this newfound zeal appeared reassuring. To those who knew him better, it was clearly the symptom of a man who had seen chaos brush too close to his tidy world and was determined never to let it happen again. Sergeant Love, Watching these adjustments to village life expressed some frustration. It's as if they've all decided to pretend none of it happened, sir. They'll go back to their knitting circles and parish committees and act as though Trace never set foot here. Pirbright, who was seated at his desk reviewing a particularly dull set of invoices, gave a small, non-committal smile. That is precisely how villages heal, Sergeant. By smoothing over the rough patches until they are barely noticeable. The event remains, but its shape grows indistinct. It becomes
Manageable, Love snorted.
manageable lies, you mean? Most truths are unmanageable, Pirbright said mildly. The best a community can hope for is to keep them folded away like fragile linen, taken out only when absolutely necessary. Later that day, Pirbright walked through the churchyard alone. The grass had recovered from the trampling of feet during the night of the fete, the earth smoothed by frost and rain. Only the faintest trace remained of where Edwin Trace had fallen, a patch of ground indistinguishable to any eye but his. The lich gate creaked softly in the breeze, as though echoing a memory no one wished to speak aloud. He paused beside the wall, his hands resting loosely behind his back. Somewhere in Oxford, he reflected, men were poring over archives, tracing histories with ink and patience. Trace had come here seeking to illuminate a forgotten corner of that history, only to find that some truths resist illumination. His note, "The truth will vanish," had not been a lament, but a prophecy. It had vanished in a way, folded neatly into silence and set aside. As the afternoon light began to fade, Pirbright turned back toward the square. From a distance, he could hear the ordinary sounds of the village, a shop bell ringing, a child calling for a dog, the rhythmic clatter of milk churns being stacked. Life had resumed its gentle rhythm, outwardly unchanged. Yet beneath that surface, a subtle alteration lingered. The villagers would continue their routines, but each carried within them a small awareness of what had been revealed and what had been left unsaid. At the station, a stack of reports awaited him. Pirbright settled at his desk, took up his pen, and began the slow work of recording the case in the dry, official language that would one day render it little more than a footnote. Outside, dusk gathered over the rooftops, softening the edges of the world. By nightfall, the village would look as though nothing unusual had ever occurred. But Pirbright, gazing briefly out the window before returning to his writing, knew better. Some events leave marks too fine for the eye to see, yet too deep for time to erase. And perhaps, he thought, that was as close to justice as any place like Flaxborough could ever come.